Thank you so much for arriving a little bit early this afternoon for this session. That's part of our Brave New Work initiative, looking at the changing nature of work. We're delighted to have so many of you here, and we appreciate your engagement, and delighted to have such a fantastic group of speakers to provoke us and to think a bit differently. So welcome, my name is Julie Caffley. I'm Executive Vice President of the Public Policy Forum. We're delighted to be back in Calgary for our Peter Lougheed Awards this evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Gina, Piikani, Nakota, Tsusut'ina, Yanahi nations, the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all of the people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. And particularly looking at the future of work this afternoon, I invite you to reflect on the resilience and the potential of the Indigenous nations in Alberta. And of course, the Indigenous youth are the fastest growing population in Canada, so I invite you to reflect on that. So today's panel is part of our Brave New Work initiative, a 3-year project where we are bringing together leaders and thinkers and doers from different sectors to talk about pathways for Canadians to prosper in a changing nature and changing future of work. And of course, Alberta is living this much more than other regions of the country. So this discussion is so important in this context. Today we're looking forward to hearing about what's being done, what we need to do to support people in work in Alberta especially, and as sectors in Canada change. PPF is very grateful to be working with our partners on the Brave New Work initiative, including our lead partner, TD Bank Group, and our supporting partners, the Business Council of Canada, Canadian Bankers Association, Cogeco, Deloitte, ESDC, General Motors of Canada, ICED, the Medcalf Foundation, and Unifor. So a really cross-sectoral group of partners who have come together to support this work over a 3-year period. So thank you very much for their support. And along that note, I'm pleased to welcome Robert Gazelle, who's Senior Vice President for the Prairie Region at TD Bank Group, to give some remarks as our lead sponsor. Robert leads approximately 2,500 employees and over 200 branches across Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Prior to this role, he was head of the U.S. contact centers for TD Bank and has held several roles in Canada, including head of credit cards, small business and merchant contact, associate vice president, human resources, district vice president, and branch manager. Robert is native to Montreal, and he's an active volunteer in the Calgary community. So please join me in welcoming Robert.
Thank you very much, Julie. Great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us this afternoon. So on behalf of TD Bank Group, we're so pleased to be supporting the Public Policy Forum on our journey through the Brave New Work initiative. I think it's going to be a fantastic panel. Really looking forward to hearing many of the insights. Clearly excited about the possibilities that the future holds for us, but also to acknowledge that changes are often met with anxiety, especially from those uncertain about how they will be impacted, will it be positive or negative. It's obviously something that we live every day in our industry that is arguably being disrupted, as are many others across the world. For us as industry leaders, though, whether in the private sector, the public sector, or the not-for-profit sectors, it's our duty to join forces, to tackle issues around the future of work, and prepare ourselves for those changes. Because quite frankly, if we are well prepared, we'll be better able to prepare those who may not be as well prepared as we are. That's why I believe personally that getting together for a panel discussion like this one and creating safe spaces where we can talk about the realities of the inevitable, the changes that are coming our way are so important and so critical to managing through them. It'll help us build a plan for how we will succeed with the transitions and maintain a productive, inclusive, sustainable, and of course, competitive economy. So at TD, our raison d'etre is to enrich the lives of customers, colleagues, and communities. We do so through our banking products and services, but also by going that extra step to help people reach their goals. That means ensuring that everyone feels ready and confident, not only in their financial future, but in their entire future. That's why last year we launched the Ready Commitment, which is our corporate citizenship platform aimed at opening doors to more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. Through our business, philanthropy, and human capital, we are focusing on 4 interconnected drivers: financial security, vibrant planet, connected communities, and better health, that when acted on together will have the greatest impact. That includes preparing people for the future of work. The fact is, the jobs we needed 10 years ago for the economy to thrive are not the jobs we will need 10 years from now. And because of the rapid degree of change we are experiencing, it's difficult to predict exactly which jobs will be modified, eliminated, or evolved. The reality is, when I think about my career, when I first started with the bank, I'm going to date myself, 29 years ago, I remember working in a branch, and at the time we used to keep handwritten ledgers of the balances and accounts. If you wanted to buy a stock, you'd have to call a stockbroker and pay $100 for equivalent for the trade. Today, everything's computerized from a ledger system. Quite frankly, we used to be able to smoke in branches, like people would smoke. There'd be typically a bottle of something in the manager's drawer. And I'd started a little bit after that, but a few years prior to me starting, the manager actually had a gun in the branches as well, right? So times have changed, some for the better, some arguably not so much so. But the reality is it has completely disrupted our industry. If you just think of the stock trading, for example, what would it cost you $100 where you needed a relationship? In some of our jurisdictions today, you can do that for absolutely nothing, right? So it's amazing how technology has disrupted and changed the industry that I work in, and I'm sure you could probably all tell a very similar story about your respective organizations and careers. The inevitable fact, though, is that the world is changing so rapidly. I know Google has come out with a statement saying that the pace of change in the next 5 years is going to be greater than the pace of change that we've seen over the last 50 years. And if you think about that, that's a pretty ominous thought and a pretty incredible thought at the same time. Change can be a powerful catalyst for a better future. The endless possibilities that lie ahead of us are incredibly exciting if we embrace them. It seems almost everywhere we go, in academic, professional, and even personal circles, there's a lot of buzz around the changes we are experiencing in all aspects of our lives. I think probably like many of you, you wake up in the morning and the first thing you say is, "Hey Google, what's the weather like?" right? And then this crazy machine answers you in your house. Kind of scary to think about what else they're listening to, quite frankly. That's even truer in our province here in Alberta, obviously. I'm glad we're spending some time today, though, focusing on the future of the energy sector, as it obviously does shape our province, is so critical to the future of Albertans. As you know, TD, being a leading bank in Alberta and in North America, supports all sectors of our economy, including the energy sector. It's a key contributor of jobs and of course, economic prosperity for many communities across Canada, as well as the United States. Supporting this sector as we are transitioning towards a new model is something we cannot ignore at TD. Our key partners in the energy sector are aware of the challenges, and they want to be a part of the solution. We all want to be a part of the solution. We need to be balanced, we need to be thoughtful, as shown by the work that has been accomplished so far by the Public Policy Forum through the Brave New Work initiative, which is of course supported by TD. So TD recognizes and takes very seriously its role in creating the conditions for a more inclusive and sustainable future for all. I look forward to hearing more from the upcoming panel about what we need to do to support people working in the energy sector as the jobs evolve. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to pass things over to our moderator for this afternoon. She's a board member at PPF, and she's also chairing our Brave New Work Advisory Council, which is a group of eminent people from across the country that are helping to guide our work. So her name is Dr. Elsa True. Elsa is the former CEO of Mars Discovery District and Maxis Technology Ventures. She's a research scientist, she's an entrepreneur, she's an innovator, and a fearless leader in so many ways. She chairs the boards of Triphase Accelerator Corporation, a cancer drug development firm. She sits on the boards at Cognicity, a brain health company. She received her doctorate in philosophy in chemistry from Oxford, where she attended it as a Rhodes Scholar. Elsa?
Thanks very much, Julie, and thank you very much for being here. I think I'm just going to jump right in and invite our panel to come up. I'll name them in alphabetical order. Mark Cameron is the Deputy Minister, Policy Coordination Office, Executive Council of the Government of Alberta. Elizabeth Cannon, well-known, former president of the University of Calgary and a geomatics engineering professor. Paul Thompson, Associate Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, ISED, at the Government of Canada. And Brad Zumwalt, who's the founding partner of the Creative Destruction Lab Rockies and also president of Zinc Ventures. Do I have to, Elsa's over here. Yeah. So we all know that the future of work is a source of anxiety for business leaders, policymakers, educators, citizens of, I think, at all stages of their career, young people, their parents, because there's just an enormous amount of change, and it's acutely felt so here in the energy sector. And so today we want to talk a bit about how can we do a better job of supporting people working in the energy sector when both energy and work are fundamentally changing. Now, as you all know, the energy sector is a primary economic sector for Canada, representing over 11% of our GDP. According to NRCan, Canada's energy sector employed 269,000 people in 2018, more than 500,000 jobs indirectly supported, and of course many of those here in Alberta. But the energy sector globally and the energy sector in Canada is in a state of pretty significant transition for a number of reasons: market conditions, technological change, climate change concerns, public policy decisions. And in those kind of transitions, you get radically new and exciting jobs emerge on the one hand, and you also, of course, have tremendous risk of dislocation. And so we have to manage that tension, I think, proactively, and I really look forward to hearing some of the comments from our panel members. And I think we should jump in maybe on a positive note, and I'll ask the general question is, where do you see real opportunities for us to ensure that Alberta's energy sector remains competitive and strong through this period of change? Let's highlight some of the opportunities that are emerging from the challenges. Mark, maybe kick you off.
Well, obviously the energy sector has had a significant downturn in the past few years, but at least in the medium term, I'm quite an optimist about the future of the energy industry. I think we've got 3 major pipelines, Keystone XL, Trans Mountain, and Bridge Line 3 that are likely to come online in the next 2 to 3 years. There is huge potential in the oil sands. The natural gas, if we can get it to market, there's a massive demand in Asia and elsewhere. And there's also great opportunity in the electricity sector. There's all kinds of new solar, renewable gas projects being announced, it seems, almost weekly. So I think if you look forward 4 or 5 years, things could be much better. However, I think the industry is likely to have less employment overall than it's had in the past. So there is still a challenge when it comes to jobs. But I think in terms of the size and scope of the industry, it's going to be as large or larger than it's ever been. Yeah.
Elizabeth?
Well, what I'm excited about is really a message that I think has started to emanate quite strongly from the energy sector, and that is one around innovation. I don't think it's being heard enough, and we can talk about that. But when you see the reduction in GHGs of about 30% since 2012, that is significant. When you see a lot of our, particularly the larger energy companies, having groups within them that are tasked with developing new technologies and leading on innovation and actually starting to pilot that at scale in their organizations, look at some of them trying to get rid of tailings ponds as an example, but really starting to think outside of the box and to talk about being a net zero producer. That's what gets young people excited, and it starts to draw in new skills. We're really seeing the convergence, and again, it's slow, but I see that accelerating of the digital oil field and people who have the skills in AI and machine learning, really feeling at home and seeing that pull from the energy sector, which I think hasn't been there, but we're starting to see it emerge. And that to me is a huge opportunity for people who are already in the sector and want to retool, but for young people coming out of our institutions as well.
Terrific. Brad?
Yeah,
Say
certainly.
you're not an energy guy?
I'm not an energy guy. I have had 2 important jobs in energy. I was on the end of a shovel for both of them. So it's been, my experience has been from the tech sector, but in the tech sector we talk a lot about this idea of product market fit. And I think what we're starting to understand is all the opportunities that come with innovation and understanding how we have product market fit. What we used to think is a commodity, actually our energy can have a lot of different attributes, and we can change the dials on those attributes to make it have different product market fit. Getting to pilots, like Elizabeth said, is very important to us with the clean tech or energy tech companies that need opportunities and homes to pilot and show their products and learn. And I think that perception is really changing in the conversations that I'm having in Calgary now. There's an awareness that we need to do things differently and maybe be more open and trusting to try some of these things. But the pace has to change, and I think there's recognition that the regulation, especially in the province, we can't operate at a slow pace due to regulation. If I speak with people and it used to take 3 weeks to get something approved and now it takes months, every other industry that's moving from weeks to days, and so we have to be moving that back from weeks to days so that we can move quickly in this space.
Paul?
Great. So this is a hugely important public policy issue. The whole issue of skills and talent is important across the whole economy. I think in this sector there's particularly acute issues that definitely need a focus. Spent a lot of time over the last government mandate engaging industry on an innovation and skills agenda, and building on the work of the Growth Council that you were involved with, Ilsa. And skills and talent were always very, very top of the list in terms of issues we're facing. This whole issue of digital revolution in the economy, we don't have a digital sector, we have a digital economy. It's pervading every industry that we're talking to. So this whole notion of how the labor force adapts to that is hugely important. I think we come at it from a position of strength from the labor force. We've got a really well-educated, in fact, one of the best educated labor forces in the world. So I think that's a position of strength. But we cannot be complacent at all, because that talented advantage you can quickly lose it. So there's a huge upside opportunity if we get this right, manage the labor force transitions well, and some real downside risks if we don't. So it really is critical on the agenda, and particularly on the issue of the workforce of tomorrow is largely the workforce we already have. So it's about reskilling and upskilling the workers that we currently have.
Mm-hmm. So the whole transition is very real for people right now, so I don't want us to get too theoretical. So maybe if I can ask, and Mark, I'll start with you again, sort of through your lens of the provincial government, in the short and medium term, where should you focus your energy to make the biggest contribution to support workers? And particularly, we're interested in the mid-career workers that are, facing these shifts in real time.
Well, so when you look at what happened in the last recession, actually the worst hit were young males in their 20s. These are people who typically would have gone, right out of high school, got a job driving a truck or working in oil and gas, making, sometimes 6 figures right away. These people are unemployed, and this is the only sector that has not come back. So currently, unemployment for men under 25 is 20%. It was 11% going into the recession. Men without high school diplomas is 23%. People over 25 with high school diplomas, it's under 6%. So this is the group that has been most directly impacted, and this is the group that didn't go to university, so they don't have readily interchangeable skills. So this is where apprenticeships, finding opportunities in areas like well remediation and some or moving into clean technology, things like that is really important. So that's some of the areas that we're looking at a lot right now.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, the opportunities for the post-secondary sector to mitigate, help?
Yeah, well, again, I'm quite encouraged in the sense that I think our post-secondary institutions, they recognize they do have to be part of this solution, and the question is, how can they do things differently? If I look at a university, the traditional model is you go, you spend 4 or 5 years there, you get your credential, and off you go. That's not very enticing for somebody who's mid-career, that maybe has 20 years experience, already has a university degree, and they want to do something different. So what you're starting to see is what we call micro-credentialing, is breaking down that body of knowledge into bite sizes. It may be a certificate, which is 4 courses, or a diploma, which is 8 courses, but allows people to come back to the institution, and hopefully flexible, maybe in the evenings and what have you, to be able to add layers to their experience and to their maybe their initial credential to allow them to pivot. So as one example, our science faculty has developed a data analytics program. Again, you can go for 4 months, you can go for 8 months, and you can have any kind of undergraduate degree. You don't have to have a science degree. But you can come in and you can specialize in one of 3 areas. It can be in sort of energy analytics, it can be in business, or it can be in the biotech space. So programs like that are hugely of interest to our community. They are oversubscribed, they're being supported by government, and they're allowing people to come back and retool in a way to allow them to get out to the workplace. I will say, you know, what I've also seen change is government responding much faster, because all of these programs have to get approvals. And again, these things, to your point, Brad, can take time. Government has been much faster at turning the approvals around so we can get programs launched. It doesn't take years, it can take months. That's really important, to be responsive. And we've also seen, of course, the private sector step forward and to be very engaged on advisory boards or hiring right out of these programs to help make sure that the curriculum is hitting in the right areas and allowing these graduates to really enhance and elevate their skill sets to be useful and to help drive the innovation I spoke about earlier.
Brad?
Yes, certainly agree. The post-secondaries have played a critical role, but not only have they done it through the main faculties, but we grew our 3 companies from an innovative program at the U of C decades ago that ran out of continuing ed, which was a post-baccalaureate program called OOST. And there's a whole generation of Calgary software companies that lived, survived, and thrived because of what they did in the OOST program. Now, I'll say with the transition employees, there's 3 levels that I would address. First of all, and you mentioned it, Mark, with your concept about high school grads earning 6 figures. There's an expectation set that has to change for these workers transitioning or new workers looking in tech. We can't pay what has been paid in the past and survive and compete globally. So there's an expectation set that has to be correct. Then there's a mindset that has to be correct. I was at a launch party event last night and spoke to about a dozen hiring tech companies, from 10 employees to 800 employee companies. And the thing that they would say again and again is this mindset before skill set. If the skills are there but the soft skills aren't, it doesn't fit with the team. They're not willing to do that. So expectation set, mindset, and then into the hard skills. You know, what are the things they need to actually pull their weight and prove their value to a team? So I think the good news is some of the hard skills are really hard to develop and master. This 10,000 hour concept to get up to be really a qualified intermediate developer. Things like mindset, with like leaders we have in this room, those things can change very quickly. And with the leaders we have in this room, things like expectation set, those things can change very quickly. We can be a place that says it's no longer possible to work for 6 figures coming out of high school, but with arming yourself with this mindset and equipping yourself with skills in this direction and then credentialing as you go along and need it, there's fantastic opportunities here. But it has to start with the soft side before we get into the hard skills.
And Paul, in the short and medium term?
Well, I think it's about how we develop a well-functioning marketplace for upskilling and reskilling, and how the different players come together. Do we have the right collaboration models for government, for industry, for post-secondary education to come together? I think there's really encouraging signs of people stepping up to do that, but I think we need to do more work on figuring out what those ideal models of collaboration are. And then there's these issues of design of programming, as Elizabeth was noting, micro-credentials and things that are much better tailored to mid-career workers. So there's part of that, I think, is identifying the best practices, and I think that's where the federal government can help jump in and try to help collect best practices from elsewhere. in the country. There's an interesting model, for example, coming out of Ontario called Palette, which is looking at the transferability of skills in one sector to another sector and building consortia of employers to help do that. So I think that kind of identification of those best practices and scaling them up is important. And then there's the whole funding model. There's programs that we've introduced, I think, that are kind of focused on individuals. There's work with employers. How do these pieces come together for some more coherent investment in upskilling an individual? It's not clear we've got the financing model well figured out.
Which I think leads really into this other question. We all know there's no magic bullet here, right? And there's also not one sector that's going to be able to fix this. And we really need leaders in each of the sectors to step up and be prepared to sort of work at new models of collaboration. I wonder if you could give us some examples of where you've seen these new models of collaboration work particularly well and encouraging and particularly, of course, supporting, employers to find and keep the right employees, but also supporting employees in transition. Elizabeth?
Well, I think we've in Calgary, what I'm sensing is that you've had a traditional, or what is seen as a traditional energy sector truly has been innovating, but it's accelerating their innovation. What you've also had is the development of a very active tech sector. Brad's been hugely involved in that has kind of operated on its own. What you've seen happen over the last few years are these sectors starting to come together. And you've had things like the rainforest that Brad has led. You've got things like the Clean Resource Innovation Network supported by the federal government, which again creates sort of a space where you can have students and researchers and industry leaders coming together and talking about what are the true challenges that are facing our sector that we want to unleash our intellectual capital on. That's what gets people excited. You've had, again, funding from the federal government for the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, which is all about energy innovation, but working closely with industry so we can tap into our graduate students and our PhDs that come from all over the world. They want to stay here, they want to contribute. We're starting to see more pathways where they can actually start to join our industry sector. So there are a number of programs, I think, that exist that start to create a community. That's what we're talking about here, because we want to retain talent. And I'll just give you one example. I had coffee with a young gentleman last week. He's 23 years old, very bright. He kind of works in the machine learning space. And he has started what he's called the Calgary AI Club. And he gets together on weekends with some of our students at the University of Calgary, particularly graduate students who are studying AI. These are people who are very bright in obviously high demand skill set areas. All of these, there's about 8 of them to start, but every week more and more show up. Every one of those students has a job offer somewhere else. Vancouver, Waterloo, Toronto, internationally. They all want to stay here in Calgary, but they're not seeing the connection. So we have to do more here to get that brain trust connected into some of the big challenges and opportunities that are impacting our energy sector so they feel part of that community. So there's more work that needs to be done, but I think the platforms are starting to be built, including the Creative Destruction Lab, which is meeting as we speak, having a whole track of companies in sort of the clean energy side where you're getting these bright young minds with big ideas looking to build companies and help be part of the solution.
And maybe, Mark and Paul, for you, collaboration between the public sector and the private sector to really get at solving these problems at the employer coalface.
For sure. I think it is part of building that innovation ecosystem and making sure there's a line of sight to the skills issues as part of that. And this need to focus on those mid-career workers, I think, can be part of that. How can they help fuel some of these startups and the new industries that are emerging through some of these really impressive programs? I had a chance to visit the CDL event earlier today, and it's amazing some of the ideas that are being generated there. But these programs that actually look at a pool of workers and identify transferable skills, from what I've seen, there's often a lot more there than you might think on the surface. You can find some foundational skills that are transferable to other settings, and then you try to find the shortest line between what you have and the skills that you need, these efficient ways of skilling up, and I think there are interesting models on the landscape. The investment we made in this Future Skills Center, one of the goals of that is to identify some of these best practices and help scale them up. One other area of the transfer agreements to the provinces for training have introduced some new flexibilities. Previously, they were only for unemployed workers, but now they can be used for existing employees as well. So there's a few avenues that are, I think, being introduced that are a little more focused on that retraining aspect that is so badly in need of.
Mm-hmm.
There are some really exciting companies involved in the energy transition that government is working closely with. I can think of people like Enerchem in Edmonton that is involved in waste to natural gas and petrochemicals, or the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line and Enhance Energy, which is basically taking CO2 from heavy industry in Edmonton, shipping it in a pipeline to central Alberta, putting it in oil fields where it's 99% of it is permanently stored, and then creating more oil, which has a net effect of actually producing oil and gas that even after you burn it, you still save more carbon than you burned. So there are some quite remarkable stories out there. Another thing I'd point to in terms of employment is the relationship with First Nations. We've gone from First Nations wanting benefits agreements to First Nations wanting to be involved in construction and procurement to First Nations being owners of major resource projects.
Mm-hmm.
We started the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation with $1 billion backstop for resource development projects involving First Nations. So that is also a really important area for creating not only employment but ownership by Indigenous communities.
So I think one of the big changes in the future of work is Elizabeth said you got some kind of training after school and then you typically stayed in one sector. Today I think it's much more common for people to migrate between sectors, even between the public and private sector, but skills are not as easily transferable. How can we make those cross-sector pathways easier for people to navigate? And also easier for employers to understand what skills a new employee from a different sector might have. Is there a role for post-secondary education institutions there, or is it more these
Well, I think there is, but
intermediaries?
it's the interface between our post-secondary institutions and employers. And what I have seen is that relationship has been strengthened. I mean, we've seen some of the work between the Business Higher Education Roundtable, the work that they're doing to accelerate the number of work-integrated learning opportunities, and it's all about having one sector not blaming the other, because I think sometimes you get, the private sector can say, well, if only the post-secondary did X, and the post-secondary says, well, we're trying to do all these things, but you're not responding. It is a two-way street, and I felt over the last few years very healthy conversations both ways, because you have to create the capacity, the pull from industry to hire those skills, and as institutions, then you have to be prepared to step up and do things differently. And when you've got a bit of a crisis, as they say, don't waste it. And I think our institutions are starting to respond, to look at credentialing, how do you explain the outcomes of the work that you're doing, but also the ability to move through the system. One of the things I think that works reasonably well in Alberta is mobility across the post-secondary sector. You may have a university degree, but then you go and get a credential at SAIT, or you've got Bow Valley College, and they all have a role in the ecosystem, and I can assure you, and I'm speaking for Calgary, all of our post-secondaries play very well together in the sandbox. They meet together, they look at programming, they look at joint programs between institutions, because that's what's going to give the opportunity for our young people to, and mid-career, to really ensure they have the right skills at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Brad, you've been very active in the tech sector, which has a lot of vacancies today. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about how we could better support workers from the energy sector to, access those opportunities, prepare for. You talked about mindset and attitude shift, but
Yeah.
how do we better understand what skills they bring that may not be described through a tech lens,
Sure.
and support them in a constructive way?
Yeah, it's a tricky area, but we need to talk about it honestly. And the salary expectation, the comp expectation has to be a reset. That's a no-go. I was involved as an investor in a company. We probably hired 200 technical people. We went through 200 hires, and we offered mid-career transitioning technical professionals a role, maybe in 50 of those times, and none of those were accepted because the comp is so different. You're talking about a 50% haircut in compensation, and who mid-career can handle a haircut like that? Now, if you go to early career professionals, they can handle that. They can adjust the budget and handle it. There are other stories where mid-career professionals, and the company that I visited with yesterday, a great company, the two technical CTOs, shared CTOs there, are both petroleum engineers. Both came from energy. Both were able, because of their family situation or their savings, to handle that haircut, and are both talked about they talked about the fatigue from the ebb and flow of the energy sector, and want to be in a spot where they're just building, building, building. So it absolutely can be done, but you can't have expectations for people to transition and take a 50% cut in pay. Then you're into the next one, which is mindset. And so the kind of hustle and the kind of mindset, I think our province has great experience to adapt to this, but it might be, you might be buried a few layers deep. I think we have to go back. I was on a call today with a friend, and he was an early engineer at Dome, and he said what he described what it was like at Dome back in those days, where you're a professional, you have a job, you go be creative and do your stuff, and you have to deliver and prove yourself, is exactly what we're talking about in talking with the founder at Adabotics, a great tech success story in Calgary, where he has, and I'm sorry for the language, but they have a motto there, which is, get your shit done, you're an adult. And so this kind of mindset isn't a technical skill that we talk about. It's not cybersecurity skills, it's not DevOps skills, it's not Ruby on Rails skills. It's like, are you willing to be on a release of a product and work 3 days in a row and sleep at the office for 3 nights? That's hard to do as a mid-career professional, right? And there's lots of business roles in these companies. And so this transition thing is tricky. We have to grow all the sectors, and we have to grow the digital sector, but to be competitive in that sector, we just can't pay a lot, right? We're in a market where we have to build, and we're gonna pay, $60,000 for junior devs and maybe 85 to 105 for intermediate devs. And that's way off the pay scale from what those people could have been earning in energy. That's fine, it is what it is, and we can transition, but it really has to be on that mindset piece. And there's story after story about how it can be successfully done, but there's no automatic, step-by-step switch. You just switch to people. It has to be in that person on the soft skill side, as opposed to, if we equip you with this and this and this, then you're going to happily go work for a 40% haircut in compensation. So we've got to get over that.
Do you have any suggestions on how we can better facilitate those hard conversations? And are there particular programs, investments that you think would be helpful for your partners from government?
Well, this is a momentum play. And so when we talk about resources that we need to grow a sector, we think about 3, and now we've added a 4th resource. And so talent, which we're talking about today. IP development, you have to have innovation, you have to have new ideas. And then lastly, capital. And capital is an essential component, and if you don't have that capital, you can't grow. It's measured in Alberta that we would have about 1/5 of the venture capital in a provincial fund-to-fund models as the other provinces. And we would also have about 1/5 the number of funded companies. So those two things make sense. If you have 1/5 of the fund-to-funds VC, you would have 1/5 of the funded companies. And so slowly, carefully, cautiously, we need to bring up and our fund-to-funds venture capital available to equal of their other provincial competitors. And then the other point that's really interesting now is where Alberta can have a huge advantage is for government to innovate around access to data. And we were speaking here earlier about a company not only needs to thrive, talent, great IP and capital, but now stores of data. I mean, you think of these companies that have massive valuations, and they chew through and can surf off of all their flows of data that they have. And we have in this province, this 4 million province with this entrepreneurial heritage and ability to work on things like that. So there's great opportunities there, and I can think of company after company in medical and health areas that could really be not just great Canadian companies, but global leaders if we can figure out a way to safely unlock this treasure trove that we have, which is this 4 million population of health data linked to education data and those kind of things. So there's really lots of interesting opportunity here. But it's that mindset first. The great news is that can change. Those attitudes can start to change tomorrow with leaders like we have in this room.
Mark, any thoughts there?
Well, I agree with what Brad just said about the data opportunity in Alberta. Alberta's got an open data strategy. I think we're the first province to have one. The AHS has, patient data on 4 million patients, which is actually one of the largest data pools of any health system in North America. You'd probably have to look at some of the big Kaiser Permanente or whatever to find larger numbers. So that's part of the reason that TELUS has said they're investing $16 billion over 5 years in Alberta, because they want to be part of that. So there are some huge opportunities around data in this province. I would agree with that. And I mean, I also want to pick up on what Elizabeth was saying, that I think we're going into an environment where we're no longer going to have people go to post-secondary, get a job, maybe have a bout or two of unemployment, collect EI, and then retire and get a pension. It's going to be all of the above all at once. They're going to be working while they're going to school. They're going to be upskilling while they're working. They won't necessarily be unemployed, but they'll be underemployed in the gig economy. And we have to figure out how we retool systems, whether it's our social systems or our education system, to deal with that reality, that people aren't going to be in one place at one time for multiple years.
Yeah, and I think in the work of the Growth Council, we looked at some of those barriers for retraining, and life gets in the way for one, when people have other family obligations and so on. But it was interesting to me that people also felt that their current employers didn't tend to value any additional effort they would make at reskilling and so on. So is there a way in which we can, get the business sector much more involved in solving this problem, not just for their workers, but for the sector as a whole? Paul?
Well, I think part of it is these collaboration models. I think it's particularly hard for SMEs to deal with some of these talent issues, particularly small, rapidly growing ones. You can't go to your VP of Human Resources to develop a sophisticated HR strategy, right? Because they're really bootstrapping and try to grow. So I think we need to help companies navigate this a little better and help bring them together to have this better functioning marketplace for the upskilling and reskilling. And also on the navigation side is just how individuals navigate it. It can be a bewildering array of programming and choices. What do you train for, and where do you go, and how do you execute your own life plan? And I think we need to help individuals navigate that as well as the companies.
Yeah. And so maybe that question for you and Mark is, how can all three levels of government work together to sort of more effectively leverage investments, because investments come from both levels, and often the municipal level, city level has some of the storefront services for people trying to figure out where to go next. How do we create collaboration between the three levels of government to make this work for workers?
Do you want to start with that, Mark?
I think that's kind of the challenge of the month, is how do we create collaboration among different levels of government right now. But there are in areas like this, and in some of the opportunities in the energy transition, some of the opportunities in different kinds of employment programs, the kinds of things that you've been talking about with the Canada Worker Benefit and so on. I think there are opportunities, and I think we just have to look harder at how all three levels of government can be working together. So.
Yeah. No, I would share that assessment. I think there are some foundational elements that are in place. So I think now it's about execution of these ideas. There have been a lot of ideas put on the table over the last few years as these issues have taken on heightened importance. But I think now it's about executing and delivering some of this programming that's seriously in need, and again finding these these good models, because these models are emerging. How do we scale them up, make them visible, and help people, both companies and individuals, navigate them?
But it's a massive change management process, right? I mean, if we think about employment centers and how they're equipped today to be the front door for workers coming in, potentially transitioning out of the energy sector into the digital economy.
Right. Those are largely places you went to when you were unemployed.
Yeah.
Especially for a period of time. I remember some of the data on this. People were showing up in these centers after they'd been unemployed for a period of time. And I think part of the key, and there's discussions I think on this, is how you make those centers for people who are currently working that are at risk, or
more
thinking
proactively.
more proactive. Yeah, make them centers to help individuals navigate, because we know that there's way better outcomes when you navigate from the position of having a job already than from being unemployed for a period of time.
Yeah. Brad?
There was 2 comments I would add to that from my discussions yesterday with the scaling companies. And one, they would say on procurement, there should be, for any government type of work, there should be some thought about what are we doing to procure from innovative Canadian companies, and how are we forcing those dialogues so that companies get to learn in infrastructure procurement or any kind of procurement what are the needs of government. There's story after story of Canadian technology companies finding a market in the UK, finding a market in the US, and not being used by provincial or federal governments. And so that's a mindset shift. That can change very quickly if we wanted to grow this sector. And second, in government, I think there's an opportunity to force innovation by demanding pace. One of the things that the companies spoke in all the programs they're in, if we demand to do things twice as fast, if all the executives in this room say, let's go back and do everything twice as fast as we do it right now, you're going to have to go search for innovation to do that. That search for innovation is going to have you bump into other startups or talk to other people that can help you with that, and you're going to be ahead. And so this what can government do sector is something that's thought about by scaling companies, and it would be great if they started to feel like they can do needs assessment with government and look to them in procurement programs as part of the help.
We're going to open the room for questions, so I'll ask one more question, and Amy is running around with the mic, so if you have a question for our panel, just put up your hand. Mark, you started us off by talking about young males without a post-secondary education as one of the vulnerable groups, but I wonder if we can touch a little bit on where are the other dislocations that you're particularly concerned about? Is there a rural-urban divide here, and how do we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about obviously First Nations, which is a concern, but I think there's real optimism there in many communities. But certainly there is a big rural-urban divide. I mean, central Alberta, particularly in the conventional oil and gas space, is in desperate times, and you don't see that in Calgary and Edmonton to the same degree you'd see it in Rocky Mountain, House or Sundre or some of these places. It's pretty desperate, and we do have to think about what we can do in these communities. So.
I'm going to jump in. That's something I'm passionate about, and that's women, which I think one of the upsides of the situation we're in here in Alberta is the old rule book does not apply anymore. So it's opened doors to, I think, to innovation on many fronts. And I think women are really starting to step up and see that opportunity. Just as an example, again, the Creative Destruction Lab, 25 companies that are in the clean energy track that are meeting today, 28% of those are women founded or co-founded. And that's actually pretty good, I think, in that sector. So we're seeing women step up, starting to innovate, create companies that are going to have impact on this sector. We're seeing organizations being formed to help support and invest in women, because that is another issue. But I think that's an opportunity for us, for women, but also to really continue to shine the light that Calgary and Alberta is a place of innovation. Again, you look at a significant number of companies that have come to be part of the CDL clean energy stream are coming from outside, not just of Alberta, but from outside of Canada. because they know this is the place where it's very sophisticated energy sector, where there's the potential for some investment if the ideas are good, and the uptake or pathway to translate that idea into scale up and adoption by the sector. So I think there are a number of good things that are happening here that we have to continue to remember and to promote to our young people and those mid-career to stay and be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Any questions? This is your chance. Give them a tough question here.
Anne-Marie Hubert, I'm from the province of Quebec. Do you feel that there's enough demand for the innovation of Alberta in the rest of the country? Every single building developer, constructor needs cleaner buildings. Every single transportation player needs cleaner resources. You can think of the future of aviation. So do you feel that there's enough being done to get to know the innovation that's happening in this part of the world and to make it available to the rest of the country? And do we think that we're doing enough to create markets for those innovations? If we have the markets, we'll figure out the training.
Paul?
Well, I think there's a great capacity in Canada, and there's a few challenges, I guess, to scaling it up. We've got huge capabilities in clean tech, especially in a few specialty areas that I think will be hugely valuable in in the energy transformation, energy transition. So that's hugely important. We've got great expertise in artificial intelligence and machine learning. I don't see that as a vertical either. That's something that should be deployed across the whole economy. So we should be thinking about these Canadian capabilities, how they can be deployed across all the different industry sectors. And I would totally agree that there's a connection between our domestic deployment and global markets that plays out, at least in part, through procurement and giving Canadian companies that first chance to market with an opportunity domestically and help them grow and build on that. But I think there are areas of critical capability in Canada that we can deploy domestically and find those markets abroad.
I would say that as someone who's from BC, spent most of my career in Ottawa and is fairly new in Alberta, there's a different conception of what the idea of transition means in Ontario and Quebec and BC than there is here in Alberta. I think they're seen as a transition away from fossil fuels, that we're going to move towards battery electric and renewables and maybe nuclear, and away from this traditional oil and gas. Whereas here people are talking about, as Elizabeth said, carbon net zero, that we can have oil and gas as a transformation of fossil fuels. And that's, 3/4 of the clean tech investment in Canada comes from the oil and gas sector. That is, and I think that's part of the story that I think has to be understood in the rest of the country.
And we're seeing it in the attraction of young people who are working within our academic institutions to do research, to be taking on some of those challenges and then moving out, through, again, CRIN, the Clean Resource Innovation Network, COSIA. There are a lot of partnership programs that are happening to be able to scale up and implement that innovation. And I think, to Mark's point, it's probably not, I should say, it is not understood, I think, across the country. If you look at the technology that is developed here in Calgary, it's not only used in Alberta, it's used globally, and that's something that we're proud of and hopefully appreciated by the rest of the country.
And I would say no, I don't think there's enough being done in our province by all of us to push our innovation as far as it needs to go. I think there's a lot more that we can do changing our mindset about that. There's a quote that I like, and I think we have brilliant experience in this province, from where our roots literally in agriculture to oil and gas to unconventional oil and gas. We have great experience, and experience plus curiosity is very powerful, and experience without curiosity is a liability. And so it's that curious nature that I think rooms like this and other executives across all the corporations can demonstrate and be role models in. If every executive in Calgary had a startup or two off the corner of her desk that she was just aware of. That would then lead us maybe to think about, and I was reminded of the great story with the Encana, announcement last week about how there was an opportunity for Albertans in the 70s to invest in Encana, and how is there something that we can do with the great CDL companies that we see so that we just have this curiosity about what are these teams building and what's coming out of our universities and what's coming out of these spin-outs and startups. But if there was more that we could do just on that kind of being curious about what else is happening in this city, I feel very lucky that I have, see some of these companies, and the teams are stunning. The founder that I was with today working on inclusive employment through, AR and VR technology is fantastic stuff. But no, I don't think we're doing enough yet to really push that innovation out so that we give the perception that this is a province that really is advancing on these fronts. We have to have that perception so that Elizabeth and now Ed can attract the kind of faculty that we need to create the kind of innovation. And if that perception wheel isn't starting to roll over on itself, it's rolling backwards. And that talent's going to go someplace else. And so we can do more, and we should do more.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me just from our experience at Mars, where we worked across multiple sectors, health, IT, and so on as well, is that the energy companies over-indexed on exports, and particularly over-indexed on exports to emerging markets. And so if you just take that lens, the opportunity for economic growth really gives you a differentiated strategy. We have room for one more question.
Thank you. My name's Scott, and I'm with the Business Council of Alberta. To the panel, when we think about the future of the new economy and work, how concerned are each of you about the idea of job destruction from things like technology and artificial intelligence and automation, or do you think that we are going to see new types of jobs fill those spaces as we have from technologies in the past?
Paul, you've studied all this.
Yeah,
you have all the consultant charts.
Yeah, so there's various methodologies and forecasts. I won't bore you with all the different approaches. There's one of the more moderate, kind of middle of the road that I kind of gravitate is some of the work the OECD has done, and they've estimated that about 13% of the jobs in Canada are at risk from automation, and that about another 29-30% are at risk of significant change. So that's a pretty big swath of the labor force. We never have that line of sight, though, to the jobs that we don't know about yet. They, just by definition, they emerge. Historically, that's generally been the case, as we see this resurgence of new areas, new occupations that we don't even know the names for yet. And if you look at the dynamism of the startup world in Alberta and the rest of Canada, I think there's a lot of potential there. And again, some of it is kind of path dependent. If we get the talent right and the innovation ecosystem right, I think we can see those jobs emerge.
So Elizabeth, how do we think about these renewable competencies that will give the employees of the future, the ability to adapt and move as the economy changes? That's the fundamental question, isn't it?
Well, it's going to take all hands on deck. I don't think any one sector owns it. It's going to be working together. But going back to something that Brad said, to me, this is about mindset. And at the University of Calgary, we call this entrepreneurial thinking. The idea that you are going to get a university degree, work at a big oil company, and life is good, those days are mostly gone. So we have to prepare our students for the world that they're entering, which is going to be, continuing to retool, but having that resilience that they are innovators. They may not all start a company, but they have to be entrepreneurial within their organizations and within their own personal careers. So setting up our graduates with those skill sets and actually preparing them for that, I think is one way that we're going to be able to help solve this over the long term.
Yeah, and Scott, I would say, like, that's a mindset piece, right? Do we want to sit back and let that happen to us? Or do we want to invent that future? There's another, the California guy, you can try to outlaw the future, but it will just happen somewhere else. So do we want to brace ourselves to respond to that change happening to us? Or do we want to support the teams and the founders and get behind them, and they can invent that here? And that's the mindset that I think that we have. That's the mindset that I think the experience and the success that we've had in this province necessitates that we move forward with.
Well, I think on that optimistic note, we're exactly on time. Please join me in thanking our panel for their insightful remarks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much to our panelists, to Mark, Elizabeth, Brad, Paul, and Ilsa for the fascinating discussion. It was much more positive than recent Calgary-Ottawa talks, so it felt kind of good. So thanks for your, focusing on solutions and the optimistic look at a kind of a scary time in terms of the changing nature of work. We are going to begin with our dinner right away, and of course this evening we'll be honoring Elizabeth amongst other honorees, and we look forward to that. The reception will be starting right outdoors as soon as we end this session. A big thank you again to our partners for helping to make this happen, to TD. I know many of our partners are in the room, Deloitte and the Business Council in particular who are here, but thank you to all of our partners. A big thank you to Rachel at Global Public Affairs, who's been supporting us in a million different ways over the last few months, and very grateful for that. And with that, I think that's it. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you in the hallway for the reception.